Okay, hey everybody, welcome to another episode of On Learn from Off the Cuff. We have another really cool review for you from the brand Alexander James watches. A little bit about the brand. They are all hand assembled in Chicago, Illinois, in the good old US of A. Essentially, he started out, Alexander, that is, he started out doing Seiko mods and wanted to bring something of his own to the market. And this particular model we'll be reviewing is actually kind of a special edition, a limited edition of one of his more classic kind of mods slash originals that he's been doing. A little bit about this type of watch. I would categorize this as an everyday watch. Now, some key common characteristics in design language. When you're looking for a watch you can wear every day, of course you're going to want that versatile blend of sporty and dressy attributes. Now, as you can see, we actually have the Alexander James watch there, right there in the center, and then we actually have it flanked by two Seiko watches, and the reason why it is because I think it actually takes a lot of inspiration from those two and kind of mash it up into something that you'll see centered there. On the left-hand side, on the upper portion of the screen, you'll see the SARX055, and you'll see that frosted snowflake washi paper style dial, which is actually quite similar to the texture that you're actually going to see on the Alexander James model. But you'll notice that it's a little bit more of a creamy color palette, which reminds me a bit of the SARB035, and also the size of the watch and the size of the dial definitely remind me more of the 035. So the SARB, that is. So what I've done here is I've got these guys in the frame so you guys can get a look. We'll also compare and contrast a bit more once we get into the details. But with that said, let's go ahead, zoom out, get these in hand, and take a closer look. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the SARX. So as you can see, this is where the dial texture is going to be taken inspiration from. We'll go ahead and hold that up here. But the overall, you know, I'd say the proportions are quite different. As you can see, a much more larger, expansive dial on the SARX versus a much more sedate, kind of a, I'd say more classically sized dial here on this piece, on the LSW001 white snowflake dial, limited edition, and it's actually part of their legacy collection at Alexander James watches and is limited to only 25 pieces. The good news is that it is extremely affordable at just basically $279.99 direct, so just under 280 bucks. Not bad. This has a 39mm diameter versus here you can see the 40 and some change diameter on this, and then also because of the thickness of the bezel and whatnot, the dial you can see is a bit more expansive, but the overall texturing there is actually quite similar, and you can see that as I bring it a bit closer to the lens. You can get a good look and a good idea of the comparison there. So very similar, but the overall tone and hue is a bit more on the creamy side. So with that said, let's go ahead and now switch gears and pull in the SARB. Now, as far as the actual sizing goes, now you're getting a little bit closer to the scale and the way that they're going to wear on the wrist, because these are a bit smaller, the dials are a bit more compact, everything is just scrunched a bit more, and then now you'll see it's funny now within contrast here, that creamy dial is offsetting the snowflake dial here to appear a lot more white in comparison. So it's almost like an in-between, I'd say, a mixture of those two ideals and kind of ideas of what an everyday kind of dressy watch could be. So as you can see here, I also have it on a leather strap with an alligator grain, but this is from B&R Bands. It's definitely a bit more kind of vintage-esque, and then I also have this swapped out with my good old trusty Grand Seiko highly finished buckle there. So you know, the SARB035 is just a real classic watch. And I think that this Alexander James piece actually gives you a lot of those same vibes, for, of course, a much lower cost. And, you know, it's basically a pre-made Seiko mod there, and you do get the, of course, that beautiful dial and definitely a lot more loom. So now that we have those out of the way, let's very quickly kind of get into a little bit more about this fine timepiece. Now, the diameter is 39 millimeters, as I mentioned before. It has a 12.6 millimeter height with a 46 millimeter lug-to-lug distance. Of course, this is all stainless steel, 316L, and then it is actually fully polished, which of course means it's going to be smudgeable and whatnot, but also it means that it's going to have a very simple and cohesive kind of design ethos in that it's all polished versus having a mixture and whatnot. I think it actually is quite a nice contrast here. And then when it comes to the crystal, it is sapphire, which is nice with that very, very just ever so slight dome there with inner AR coating. Quite legible still though, because I'm sure it is domed on the underside as well as the top, and you can get a nice idea of that little dome peeking out from above the case. Signed crown, of course, screw down, which is nice because this is actually 10 atmospheres or 100 meters water resistant, and the fact that it is screw down really helps with your confidence level. The bezel is a fixed bezel, as you can see here. It's quite thick, I'd say, in comparison, but not overly thick where it looks like maybe this was meant to have some type of rotating bezel or anything like that. So I think it actually is quite handsome, just the case alone. And then, of course, when you add in this type of dial, I have a weakness for these really cool textured dials, especially in the vein of Seiko. Now, as far as the movement, we have our Seiko instruments, NH35. So hacking and hand wide, well, basically the equivalent to a 4R movement. And then this being the date only, meaning it's the 35 versus the 36. As far as that, a little bit to go into kind of the dial, hands, indices, textures, and whatnot. We do have that frosted texture dial with applied indices, polished hands, Mercedes hands at that, and then you're going to have BGW9 Loom. I think as far as the handset choice goes, because this is, of course, on a Seiko movement, I think it would have been nice to have the Yaboki's Grand Seiko hands on here. Of course, then the loom wouldn't have matched, but I think that actually would have been a really nice touch. And as far as the shapes of the indices go, I think it actually would have flowed really quite well. So maybe he'll make me a mod like that sometime. So if you're listening, Alexander James, definitely I am interested. So the loom on here is, of course, BGW9, like I mentioned, so it's going to appear nice and crisp in daylight when fully lit, but then in darkness it's going to have that great blue hue tone. This one is, of course, 100 meters water resistant, which is great. And then very minimalist on the other side, reminds me a bit of kind of that Seiko 5 architecture. Very simple, not much to look at, but definitely feels great on the wrist. As you can see, 20 millimeter lugs with these great spring bar, kind of quick action spring bars in there, so you can do that actually toolless and swap out straps very easily. And I think this will, of course, look killer on many different strap options, but I think it does a nice kind of air of class there with the black crocodile pattern. So the taper on this is 20 millimeters, and it tapers down to 18 millimeters, down to this fully polished buckle there, so all quite good. So with that said, let's go ahead and get some loom shots and the light transition going for you. Whoops, I was supposed to turn off the camera, not the light, so let's go ahead and switch shots. Okay, way off, totally forgot to get this on the wrist. Of course, on the wrist from off the cuff, it would be a little rough without a wrist shot. So as you can see on my 7¼ inch wrist, put a little more arm in there, give you a little bit of idea of perspective where it's really, really nice. Even up close, where the lens is gonna really distort that image there and make the watch head seem a lot bigger than it really is. It still fits pretty well. And as you can see, rides on the wrist really nicely. Very comfortable. Of course, this isn't like the greatest leather strap or anything, but I wouldn't quite call it a throwaway like you would on 90% of Seiko straps that you get. So I think that's all good, especially considering the price point being under 300 bucks. But I think this is definitely a nice versatile piece there that can be worn. Obviously, it has all that loom on it, which is great. So it's going to be really useful kind of on the sporty side, 100 meters water resistant, also with a screw down crown. But I think it's actually dressy enough, especially on this black strap there, or any black strap you end up putting it on, to actually make it quite wearable and kind of able to be dressed up and dressed back down. Can see there, really nice, easy to get that under a cuff, decent taper there on the strap. But let's go ahead and now finally move on to some of those Loom Shots we talked about. Okay, let's go ahead and get a Loom Shot, little charge there. You can see even with the studio lights on, a little black light from a distance still helps it illuminate quite nicely. Very handsome. But let's go ahead and get into the real darkness here. As you can see, that BGW9 is just pumping away, really, really nicely applied, really nice and thick there, and that blue tone is just shining straight through. Really, really, really nice to see. But one of the things I do like to get into when it comes to these Loom Shots is I like to get into some low light transition, because you're not always going to be out in broad direct sunlight, broad daylight, whatnot. You're going to be transferring in and out of the vehicle, in and out of buildings and whatnot, kind of in and out of really well-lit situations to not so well-lit situations. So it's really great to actually see the way that the light plays off of this dial. And of course, with the fully polished case there's not too much to give away. You know, normally you can kind of track the fine brushing here. This is of course a press loaner, so this model is actually, it's probably quite smudgy, one because it's hot in here and my hands threw some smudges on it. But you know what, let's go ahead and so you can see it just wipes right off. As far as the case finishing, the polish is quite nice luster to it, but what I'm really digging is that actual BGW9 in combination with that beautiful, beautiful Snowflake dial. And the nice thing is, unlike the Seiko, you actually don't have, you know, a bunch of text or anything really blocking or obscuring those beautiful textures. You're pretty much getting a full-on look there at the texture, and it's really uninhibited, which I think is really great on this particular model. And then of course at the scale, it's also where it's quite a bit smaller than your typical SARX, which I think is really, really good, because most people are looking for a smaller version of that watch. Now I do have a bit thinner version that's only slightly smaller in my SJE073, but that is a really much more expensive watch, so I didn't even want to pull that into frame during this review. Now on the wrist, very nice classic proportions, feels a bit like a pre-made Seiko mod, but there's nothing wrong with that, and there's probably a reason it feels that way, because it kind of is. Now, as far as model variants go, there are actually, for this particular case, within the Legacy collection, there are tons of different variations. So you definitely check those out, follow the links below. As far as comparable models, I don't think I would really compare this to many other things. It is just, I mean, probably it's most comparable to Seiko mod. And at the same time, it's so it's fully loaded. I mean, it's sapphire, hacking hand windable movement. You got a Snowflake dial. You got BGW9 loom. So there's just it's screw down crown, right? So there's just a lot it has going for it. So it's hard to compare something, especially in this price range, well under 300 bucks, at right around $280. So the bottom line, really, this is a really fun and unique everyday timepiece that I think is actually really, really cool and has tons of personality. I'd say probably my biggest nitpick would be the choice of the Mercedes hands, but when you actually look at the range for this particular watch, the head and whatnot, you'll see that that's actually, the Mercedes hands are a bit of a staple as far as this particular model goes. But again, if you're listening, Alexander, I think it'd be really cool to have some Grand Seiko-esque, kind of those cathedral hands that Yaboki's makes would look really, really cool on this one. Maybe even do like a gilt model. That'd be really cool as well. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you liked the video, please do hit like. If you haven't already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.